Hello and welcome to the Bucketlister Podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford, along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Bucketlister Podcast. I am your host Keith Crockford and I am back with Jake again. He's in the country far too long and he just wants to come onto the podcast. So hello Jake.
Well, it's my only time in the week where I get to talk to you.
Yeah, and I can turn you straight off afterwards, so it's perfect. But before we start this episode of the podcast, if you could please do me a favor and go and like and subscribe, that would be absolutely amazing, because we want more and more people to hear this podcast. And by having more reviews, it tells the podcast engines that people like this podcast and we're going to show it to more people. So if you could just take a second to go onto your phone or your computer and just click the review and give us 5 stars or 4 stars, or if you don't like it, give us 1 star. But I'd rather, if you didn't like it, why are you listening to it? So that's my point on that one. Anyway, I had a question. So I've been in the country for a few weeks, and I opened up my diary to have a few calls with people, and people could book some time in my diary to phone me up to talk about trips. And ask any questions they had. And I had an interesting question the other day, Jake, which we're going to talk about today. So we're going off the cuff today because you didn't even know what I was talking about. But we're going to talk today
quite often I don't.
Yeah. I agree. But today we're going to talk about jackets and which jackets people should buy for their trips. Now, obviously, it's a difficult one because obviously every trip is different. Some are colder than others. But the conversation that I had with this client, and this client was off to do Machu Picchu, actually, and wanted to know whether he should buy a thick waterproof jacket. And that was a really easy one for me to answer, because I was like, no, you don't want a thick waterproof jacket, because what happens if it's raining when it's hot? Like, you're going to get really, really warm wearing a thick jacket. So I just thought today we'd put our 2 penneth work in, Jake, on what jackets, not necessarily the brand of jackets, because obviously everyone likes different styles and people have different budgets. And, you know, we all know you can go and spend anything from £50 for a waterproof jacket to £600 on a waterproof jacket. So, you know, we're not going to say to you, you need to go and spend £400 on this really great jacket, because that's not what's in people's budgets. But I thought we'd look at like layering and the importance of jackets and having the ability to cope with many different situations when you're on a trip.
Yeah, so it is a good question that lots of people come up with, and you know, and it is something that is kind of applicable to every single one of our trips. You know, people talk about certain things like jackets. You know, the short answer, we'll go into a bit more detail, but the short answer is that once you've got the perfect layering system, everything else becomes really easy. And that's something that I've found over the last couple of years, is that I've got a few jackets, but they can all be used together, or I can just not take a thicker one and just have a thinner one. But basically, I've got a really good layering system that works all the way from trekking in the Sahara to climbing Kilimanjaro. And that's kind of a plus 30 degrees to minus 30, depending on the wind chill and time of year that you go and climb Kilimanjaro. So that's the key thing that I'll say to people. But definitely, before you start looking at what the best jacket is to buy, it really does depend on the environment that you're going into. And there's a few things to consider. So exactly like you've just pointed out, one is the temperature of the country that you're going to come into, because when we're talking about waterproof jackets, they come on all of our trips. They come on all of my trips anyway, but I always make sure I don't have a thick one. It's always one that I can put over the top of an actual insulated jacket that's going to provide me with the warmth. So I'm never looking at a waterproof jacket to provide me any warmth. And then we start going on to the higher end and more extreme end in terms of cold. And that's where we want a jacket that is going to be really, really insulated and provide me with a lot of warmth. Now, the challenge with that I suspect we'll talk about in a minute will be the weight versus warmth discussion, because I can think of some really, really warm jackets, but I would never take them on a trip because they're far too heavy and they would just use up all of my weight allowance.
Yeah, I think, the key to this whole thing is when it comes to it is layering. And I would probably have 3 different jackets with me on a trip. Like I'd have a very thin jacket. I would have a synthetic stroke down warmer jacket. And then I would have my waterproof coat that, like you say, has the ability to go over the top of all of those as the final layer. Now, again, when it comes to a waterproof jacket, with mine, I've got pit zips in mine, so I can open it up on the sides. Like if I think, we've got a Kilimanjaro trek at the minute, the number of times I've worn a waterproof jacket in the rainforest at the start, and it could be pouring down with rain, but still be 28 degrees. And you kind of have to sit there and go, do I want to be dry or do I want to be too hot? Like that's the sort of question you need to ask yourself. So that would be my sort of solution to the problem, is having 3 jackets, because then it doesn't really matter then. Like, so a lot of the time I'm probably not going to be walking in my warm down jacket, because when you're walking, your body temperature is up anyway. I mean, most people only really wear their thick down jacket in the evenings around the camp, or if you're on an Everest base camp trek, wandering through Namche in the evening, or when you get in there, because your body temperature then starts to cool down and you start to feel cold. But the number of people you see wearing a big thick down jacket in the tea house in the evening because they're cold, but they haven't been wearing it all day. And a lot of the time, again, when you're walking, you could just be in a base layer, and it's actually when you come to stop that you just need to put that additional layer over the top of you to keep you warmer. So for me, I use the 3 jackets, and I've got a really thin kind of, I wouldn't say it's a synthetic thin insulated jacket, and then I've got plenty of thicker both synthetic and down coats, and then I've got at the minute, I've got I can't even think what my waterproof is at the minute. I think I've got a Sherpa one, and I've got another one that I can't remember what make it is at the minute, but that's kind of my layering up system, if you like. And then same wise for, we talk about jackets, but actually, from a waterproof perspective, which was where this conversation went, like I've got a very thin pair of waterproof trousers that are just there really for keeping dry. But at the same time, I've also got a thicker, more mountaineering salopette pair that are just a bit more rugged. And, to depend on which trip I'm on will depend which I'll take in essence.
Yeah. So something that you mentioned a minute ago was about synthetic and down. And, and I think that's definitely something I've brought up with a lot of people when you're looking at the warm jackets is trying to decide whether you want to go for a synthetic down jacket or a down jacket, i.e. duck or goose or, anything along those lines. Now, purely looking at it from a warmth perspective and a technical perspective, I would say that down is warmer and then synthetic down slightly, marginally less so. But the big advantage for going synthetic down, and why most of my jackets are, is because if they get wet, the down doesn't clump. And that's something where if I'm doing an Everest base camp trek where we do quite often get rain, whilst trekking through, then I'll always make sure that I've got my synthetic jacket, because if it does get wet, it won't clump. However, my sleeping bag, which is always in a dry bag, that stays as real down. Weighing up the options between synthetic and real down, those are kind of one of the things that you want to consider when buying a jacket, or you kind of your down jacket, your warm jacket. And I also, again, completely agree with sort of having around 3 jackets. I'd say the only thing that I have started taking with me on trips that adds to that is I've started taking a gilet. So, you can get different styles of like the body gilets. I did get a down one last time I was in Nepal from Namche. Quality's still pretty good. But that's something I started taking because
Which logo did you have put on it?
Well, they put a North Face, but I've started calling it my South Face because it's just not quite there. But brilliant, really, really warm. And what I found is that, again, depending on the trip that I'm doing, I might be able to then not take a bigger, heavier jacket, which, as you said, tends to just be worn around the tea house. And actually, I'll just wear my gilet and then a down jacket over the top. So, yeah, I suppose my combination of the three in that instance would be a gilet, a down jacket, and then a waterproof jacket. And if it's really, really cold, then I will take a bigger down jacket. Now, you've got the mountain equipment, is it the Annapurna jacket? And I've got the mountain equipment Fitzroy jacket, which is a belay jacket. So it is slightly water resistant. It's really big. It's really thick. It goes on over the top of everything. Basically, it's designed to do that. But I'll still have my waterproof jacket up and over the top. And I always make sure that the waterproof jacket is kind of a size bigger because of that. I'm going to be wearing layers underneath it.
Do they do a double XL in waterproof jacket?
I know what. I was waiting for a comment like that. But yes, I think they do.
Well, in terms of, I mean, like for me, like my Annapurna mountain equipment is now probably 20 years old. It's exactly the same jacket pretty much that they still make now. And it very rarely comes out of the bag because it is just too warm. Like it is like, I know I've lent it to a few of our guides who have done island peaks and things like that because they didn't want to go and spend all that money and buy an expensive jacket for one trip. And it just very rarely gets used because of A, it's super bulky, and B, it's so warm. Like, I the last time I wore it, I think was on Kilimanjaro, and I was literally walking up Summit Night with the zip undone just because it was just so hot wearing that jacket. Now, I am generally a warm-blooded person. Like, I don't feel the cold as much as other people generally do. So I'm probably not the person to take advice from on this. And I know I've had conversations with Dave before where, we've been on a mountain, it's been freezing cold, and I'm walking up with no hat or gloves on, and all the group are kind of absolutely freezing, saying how cold it is, borrowing my spare stuff. So I think obviously, you know personally how cold you get to then how you're going to react to that and what layers you're going to need. And obviously, again, it's very difficult to work that out in the UK of how cold it's going to be when you get up and start trekking to Everest Base Camp from L'Auberge at 5 a.m, or how cold it is walking up, to Kilimanjaro in the evening. Like, you can't really prepare for it. And the trouble with it is we can only give you a worst case scenario, really, because it could be that the wind chills right up that day and it's really cold, or it could be that there's no wind and actually it's a really sort of, as I would say it, warmish summit night. But again, you need to pack for the worst case scenario, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was having that conversation again yesterday where somebody was talking about, I was describing the jackets that I would be taking on my upcoming Kilimanjaro trek. And I said, well, I'm going to take, again, my layering system was, and I do run a little bit cold on Kilimanjaro. I do get a little bit cold. So I say, right, well, I've got my thermal base layer and then I'll put a fleece on over the top. And then I might have my gilet. Otherwise, I'll have my thinner down jacket, my bigger down jacket, and then my waterproof. I know that sounds like a horrendous amount. I mean, my backpack is basically empty because it all goes in when the sun comes out. But for me, that's perfect. And then I had a load of people on this call coming back and being like, so do we all need to go out and buy 2 jackets? So no, you don't need to now go and buy 2 down jackets. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm just saying that if you're a person that runs particularly cold, then you might want to consider making sure that you've got some really good base layers, or if you've got another jacket, then great. But it will depend on you. And unfortunately, I think that is something that you can only find out with experience. And that might not be very helpful to somebody who is climbing Kilimanjaro or going to Everest Base Camp for the first time. But hopefully, with the winters you'll have experienced in the UK and what everyone else is saying around you, you will have a rough idea whether you tend to be a bit cold or a little bit hot. And that should give you a good indication. But yeah, a layering system is one of the key things. The other thing,
I think if you think about it in terms of stuff you'd have at home anyway. So you'd have a base layer if you're trekking in the UK. You'll have a fleece of some kind, a Polartec fleece or something like that. You'll have a soft shell jacket. You'll have your insulated jacket, and then you'll have your waterproof jacket. So you've got 5 layers there that you can sort of add, remove, take off as you go, which should give you at that point plenty of warmth from having that basic system, which means that you don't necessarily have to go out and buy anything else.
Yeah, so if you do a lot of hill walking and hiking in the UK, you don't necessarily need to go and buy a load more kit. And there is always the option of renting. That's something that we discussed as well. There is always the option of renting. But you don't necessarily need to go out and buy loads and loads of stuff. But that is what we mean by a layering system. It is just layering up. And that works really well from day one all the way to the end, because, I always say to people as well, you don't want to start too hot either. So you don't want to be starting out on the trek wearing all of your layers, because you're just going to end up stopping 5 minutes in and taking them off. So finding that balance, but having things that are easy to unzip and vent off. And you mentioned at the very beginning, your waterproof jacket has ventilation zips underneath the arms. I think those are brilliant. You've got the ability to sort of vent off if you do get a little bit hot. The other thing that I love on jackets, and this is something that I will mention, if you start looking at a jacket, it's just a nice thing to have, is two things, I suppose. One is where the pockets are situated at the front, because I've got on my waterproof jacket, it's a mountain equipment, I think it's the Lutzi jacket or something like that. I can't actually remember. But the pockets for your hands are slightly higher, so they sit sort of around your midsection rather than your waist. And what that means is that when you've got the waist strap round on your rucksacks, because you should be having all of the weight from your rucksack sitting on your hips, when you've got that round, with any other jacket, you wouldn't be able to get your hands in your pocket. But obviously, because they sit slightly higher, you can still fit your hands in your pockets, keeps them nice and warm if it's a cold day. And the other thing that I always look for on a jacket these days is if they've got something called a Napoleon pocket, which is basically a breast pocket, so zips open on the chest. And I just find those so useful for storing quick things to get to. So the map and the compass, or, anything else that you need to get access to, and you don't want it in your rucksack. You don't want it getting squished down by the pockets or anything like that. So those are just a couple of things. Oh, and I forgot the most important one that I was explaining on our training weekend, was with your waterproof jacket. If you make sure you get one that has one of the wires in the hoods, then it actually fits onto your head a lot better. And when you turn your head, the jacket turns with you, because you wouldn't believe the amount of people that neglect that, especially with the slightly cheaper brands of jacket. And when they turn their head to the side, they're just looking into the hood of their jacket. You want a bit of yeah.
Yeah, and I also think the other thing to think about when you're looking at jackets is to think, when you're looking at your waterproof jacket, because if you're going to go and spend some good money on it, is make sure that it's going to go with you through your adventure travel journey. As I was saying, like, I've got a coat that's 20 years old that I'm still using now, that still looks brand new. You can still buy it. So when you're going into a shop and trying on your waterproof jacket, go and take the biggest down jacket that they've got in the shop and test that you can get it on over the top of it. If you're ever going to think about going and doing like a winter toop cow or a Mira peak or an island peak, and you're going to need to be wearing a climbing helmet, like, make sure the hood will go up over a climbing helmet. So go and put a climbing helmet on in the shop and actually make sure that the hood of the jacket goes up over the helmet, just so that actually, in 2 years' time, you might be buying this coat now for Kilimanjaro or Everest Base Camp, and then you go, oh, actually, I want to do Aconcagua or Winter Toop Cow or Mira Peak, and suddenly, you're then going to need a coat that will go over the top of a helmet. So just think about what you might be doing in the future, to make sure when you're getting your kit now, it's actually going to be fit for purpose in 2, 3, 4 years' time with whatever it is you're looking to do.
Absolutely. Buy cheap, buy twice.
That's it. We all know that saying. And, and don't get us wrong, like we're not saying go out and spend loads and loads of money, because that's not what we're saying. We understand that people are on a budget. These trips have been like super expensive, and suddenly, you've now got this kit list to buy as well. But, just think about, hey, am I only going to be using this once? Because if you're only going to be doing it once, you might as well hire it. But still hire a good quality jacket. But if this is something you're going to use time and time and time again, then maybe you want to invest in that kit now. Anything else, Jake?
No, that's it from me.
Well, I think we've covered jackets off fairly well in that one. And I think it's a super important topic to go through, because it kind of covers quite a lot of our trips, that you're going to need a waterproof jacket. And I even put a waterproof on in the Maldives this year because it was raining. So you are going to use them in hot places as well. So that's why, as answer to my friend's question the other day, you don't need a thick waterproof jacket. Well, that's it from me and Jake this week. I will be back with another episode of the Bucketlister Podcast next week. Remember, please, if you can, go and give us a great review and just subscribe to the podcast. It shows the search engines that actually people do like and listen to this podcast. So that would be really helpful. But thanks very much. Hope you've enjoyed it. And until next week, goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucketlister Podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.